Late July 1944, a stretch of road near the French village of Roncey. A German Tiger crew, part of a column trying to escape encirclement, spots an American column moving in the distance. By every rule of tank warfare that had defined most of this war, this is a straightforward engagement. Their 88mm gun can identify and destroy an American tank from a range the enemy can't effectively return fire from. They open up, and within minutes, before the smoke from their own shot has even cleared, 4 P-47 fighter bombers appear directly overhead, diving on their position with rockets and machine gun fire as though they'd been waiting for exactly this moment. No radio call passed between the German crew and anyone else. No visible signal went out, and yet the enemy in the sky already knew precisely where to look. How did the Americans respond this fast, this precisely, without the Germans ever seeing it coming? The answer wasn't the weapon. It was the system behind the weapon. And to understand what that system actually was, you have to go back 2 years to a much less famous campaign where American commanders first discovered how badly they were wasting the airplanes flying above their own tanks. Here's the mismatch this entire story hinges on. Going into 1944, both sides had airplanes, and both sides had tanks. What they didn't have, on either side equally, was a fast way to connect the two. A pilot circling above a battlefield could often see exactly what a tank column below him couldn't. A hidden anti-tank gun, a column of enemy armor waiting around the next bend, a bridge already destroyed ahead. But without a way to tell the tank commander in real time, that information was worthless the moment the aircraft turned for home. This wasn't a German problem or an American problem specifically. It was a structural problem built into how armies had always fought wars, going all the way back to the first time infantry and artillery had to coordinate without radios at all. In North Africa in 1942 and 1943, and then again in the grinding Italian campaign that followed, American commanders learned exactly how expensive this gap could be. Tank columns advanced into anti-tank ambushes that friendly reconnaissance aircraft had spotted from the air only minutes earlier, with no mechanism whatsoever to pass the warning down before it was too late. Pilots returned from missions having watched entire engagements unfold beneath them, unable to do anything but write a report once it no longer mattered to anyone still alive on the ground. Commanders studying these failures afterward reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The problem was never a shortage of information. The Allies usually had more than enough eyes in the sky. The problem was that the information had nowhere fast enough to go. Picture the old workflow this created, step by painful step. A pilot spots the enemy. He returns to base, or radios a controller far behind the lines. That controller relays the report up a chain of command. Someone with the authority to approve an airstrike reviews the request. If approved, new aircraft are scrambled, given coordinates, and sent to find a target that, by this point, has often already moved. By the time the aircraft actually arrived over the right stretch of ground, the battlefield had usually already changed into something the original report no longer described. Here's the part of this story that keeps it from becoming a simple smart side versus slow side narrative, because the Germans weren't oblivious to this exact problem. If anything, they'd understood it first. German doctrine on close air-ground cooperation, developed through the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 through 1941, had genuinely pioneered elements of this coordination. Liaison officers attached to armored spearheads, dedicated radio links between forward units and supporting Stuka squadrons, and a doctrine explicitly built around combining air and ground power into a single, fast-moving punch. The German army wasn't behind on the concept. For a period early in the war, they had been ahead of everyone. So if the Germans understood the problem first, why didn't they solve it the same way the Americans eventually would? That question sits at the center of everything that follows, and the honest answer is more institutional than technological, a difference that would take years and a specific man's stubborn persistence to fully expose. That man was Elwood Quesada, an American general who by 1944 commanded 9th Tactical Air Command, supporting the U.S. First Army. Quesada wasn't a tank officer, and he wasn't a conventional bureaucrat either. He'd cut his teeth on close air support tactics in North Africa and Italy, watching firsthand how badly information failed to move between the men flying overhead and the men fighting below. What made Quesada unusual wasn't a single flash of genius. It was his refusal to accept that air power and ground power belonged to two separate conversations. He believed, with a stubbornness that put him at odds with more conventional airmen who considered anything besides strategic bombing beneath their attention, that the fighter-bomber's real value was measured by how fast it could respond to what a soldier on the ground was looking at in that exact moment. In July 1944, just as American forces were preparing to break out of the Normandy beachhead, Quesada made a decision that sounds almost absurdly simple in hindsight. He didn't ask for a new aircraft. He didn't request a new radio technology. He took the existing VHF radios his fighter pilots already carried in their cockpits, and he put the same radios inside American tanks. That's the entire innovation, a shared frequency. Nothing about the airplane changed. Nothing about the tank's armor or gun changed. What changed was that, for the first time, a tank commander and a fighter pilot could speak to each other directly, in the same language, in real time, without a single layer of headquarters standing between the moment a threat appeared and the moment a response arrived. Here's how it actually worked in practice, and the technical details matter because each one solved a specific, previously fatal delay. Quesada didn't simply hand a radio to whichever tank crewman happened to be free. He assigned specially trained air liaison officers, pilots themselves, in many cases, to ride inside the lead tanks of advancing armored columns. This wasn't a tank crew fumbling through unfamiliar procedure under fire. It was a pilot speaking pilot's language directly to another pilot, describing terrain and targets with a vocabulary that stripped away the ambiguity that had doomed earlier attempts at coordination. Every American vehicle involved in this system was also repainted with fresh identification markings, white stars alongside distinctive colored panels, specifically so pilots overhead could distinguish friendly armor from enemy armor at a glance, solving the identification problem that had caused dangerous hesitation and sometimes tragic mistakes in earlier campaigns. And this wasn't a one-time trick used in a single engagement and then forgotten. Quesada scaled it into a genuine system. 4 plane flights of P-47 Thunderbolts held continuous station above advancing American armored columns, and these flights never simply left a gap in coverage when they ran low on fuel. New flights arrived to relieve the old ones before they departed, meaning that from the moment a column began moving, it operated underneath a rotating umbrella of airborne firepower that essentially never left. This required forward airfields, built and rebuilt constantly just behind the advancing front lines, using nothing more than wire mesh and burlap sheets laid over hastily leveled ground, so that fighter squadrons could leapfrog forward in step with the tanks they were protecting. By the time this system matured fully, it wasn't an improvisation anymore, it was infrastructure. Now put yourself back inside a German Tiger on the receiving end of this system and try to see the battlefield the way its crew actually saw it. What could they see? An enemy tank column visible on the horizon, exactly like 100 other columns they'd engaged on other fronts. What did they know? That their gun could kill that column's tanks before those tanks could effectively fire back. What didn't they know? That somewhere inside that column, a man wearing a pilot's wings, sitting inside a Sherman tank instead of a cockpit, was already keying a radio handset the instant the first shot was fired. This is where the real analytical heart of the story sits, because the difference wasn't really about who had better weapons at all. Compare the two decision cycles directly. The German cycle, inherited from years of fighting on fronts where this kind of instant coordination didn't exist. Spot the enemy, report back through the chain of command, wait for headquarters to authorize a response, wait again for available aircraft, and hope the target hadn't moved by the time help arrived. The American cycle, after Quesada's innovation, spot the enemy, speak directly into a radio already tuned to the exact frequency the aircraft overhead was monitoring, and watch the attack begin within minutes. The Americans weren't necessarily destroying German tanks because their weapons were superior. They were destroying them because their decision cycle was shorter, because the distance between seeing a problem and solving it had been compressed from hours down to minutes. You can watch this tempo advantage play out in specific documented moments during the collapse of the German position in Normandy in late July 1944. Near the village of Roncey, as remnants of the German 7th Army tried to escape encirclement during Operation Cobra's aftermath, P-47 Thunderbolts of the 405th Fighter Group caught a retreating German column strung out along the roads and destroyed 122 tanks, 259 other vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces in a single sustained engagement. Column spotted, radio call made. Aircraft already overhead turned toward the report. Attack pressed home before the column could disperse or find cover. This wasn't a lucky ambush. It was the system, functioning exactly as Quesada had designed it to function at the exact moment German forces most needed the sky to be empty. But here's where the popular version of this story tends to get it wrong, and it's worth pausing to correct it, because the truth is more interesting than the myth. Post-war British operational research teams examining the actual wreckage left behind on Normandy's battlefields found something that surprised even the analysts conducting the survey. Airstrikes were directly responsible for only somewhere between 2 and 7% of all German tank losses during the entire campaign. Pilots flying fast, low, and under fire routinely overclaimed their results by a factor of roughly 10 to 1 compared to what ground surveys later confirmed. The famous image of rocket-firing fighter bombers single-handedly destroying wave after wave of German tanks simply doesn't hold up against the physical evidence left on the ground afterward. Most Tigers that armored column cover engaged didn't actually die from a direct rocket or bomb hit at all. So if the tanks mostly weren't being destroyed outright, what was this system actually accomplishing? Here's the deeper effect, the one that mattered far more than any individual tank kill. The aircraft didn't have to destroy the Tiger to defeat it. What armored column cover consistently destroyed instead was everything a Tiger needed to keep functioning as part of an army. The fuel trucks resupplying it, the ammunition columns feeding it shells, the recovery vehicles that would have towed it to a repair depot after a breakdown, the bridges and roads it needed to retreat along, and above all, the German army's ability to move anything at all during daylight hours without inviting immediate, overwhelming retaliation. A Tiger could survive an entire afternoon of air attacks with its armor completely intact and still lose the battle, because the column it belonged to had been strangled of fuel, isolated from repair, and forced into a nighttime. Only existence that crippled its actual combat effectiveness far more thoroughly than a single rocket ever could. This reframing forces a reconsideration of what everyone assumed the evidence would show. The popular belief holds that fighter bombers won the tank war in France by burning German armor on the roads in spectacular, one-sided duels. The actual battlefield surveys show something more mundane and in some ways more devastating. German armored formations arriving in Normandy and later retreating from it were being systematically starved, isolated and slowed by a system that mostly wasn't even killing the tanks it was credited with destroying. The kill claims were myth. The strategic paralysis they caused was very real. Which brings us to the second, harder question this story raises. Not why didn't Germany have the same radio, because by this point in the war, German industry could certainly have produced one. The real question is why Germany, despite having understood air-ground cooperation first, couldn't build the same system the Americans eventually did. And the answer sits almost entirely outside of technology. German air and ground forces operated under separate institutional cultures with different chains of command. And by 1944, the Luftwaffe was chronically short of both aircraft and fuel, with what remained increasingly pulled back to defend German cities from Allied bombers, rather than support tanks on a collapsing Western front. There was no equivalent of Quesada, no single officer with the institutional freedom, the ground-level combat experience, and the stubbornness to physically bridge two branches of the military that had, for years, spoken past each other rather than to each other. Germany had the radios. Germany had, at one point, even had the doctrine. What Germany didn't have, by the summer of 1944, was an institution both willing and able to connect the pieces it already possessed. That's the historical irony sitting at the center of this entire story. The Germans had pioneered air-ground cooperation in the opening years of the war, built real doctrine around it, and fielded specialized liaison vehicles for exactly this purpose. And then, through a combination of institutional rigidity, resource collapse, and the simple absence of one man willing to force two stubborn branches of the same military to actually talk to each other, they let that early advantage evaporate completely, right as the Americans were finally building the version of it that worked. Go back one more time to that stretch of road near Roncey, to a Tiger crew watching an American column through their gun sight, trusting in the advantages of armor and firepower that had served German tank crews well for years, on other fronts, against enemies who hadn't yet closed the gap between the ground and the sky. Now you understand what they couldn't see. Somewhere inside that column, a pilot sitting where a machine gunner used to sit was already speaking into a handset, describing their exact position to a flight of thunderbolts already turning toward the sound of the engagement, not to necessarily destroy the tank in front of them, but to make sure that tank and everything supporting it would never fight effectively again. As for Quesada himself, the man who made this entire system possible largely vanished from popular memory of the war. He never became a household name the way Patton or Eisenhower did, despite Eisenhower's own staff crediting his innovations as essential to the speed of the Allied advance across France. He continued serving after the war, eventually becoming the first head of the Federal Aviation Administration, applying the same instinct for connecting separate systems into something faster and safer to the skies of peacetime America. A man who had spent the war teaching pilots and tank commanders to speak the same language spent his final public role teaching commercial aviation to do something similar. It was never really about the tank, or the gun, or even the airplane. It was about how fast one side could turn what it saw into what it did, compared to the enemy standing in front of it. That wasn't a weapon, it was a choice. One general's decision to connect two branches of the same army that had, for years, been fighting the same war without ever fully talking to each other. If you want to see what happened when the Germans finally attempted their own late war version of this coordination, and why the attempt arrived years too late to matter, that's a story for another video, and it's coming next.